My friend and Team Jacked co-host Kaiser Shonen has been subjecting me to a depraved mutual torture session where we sit and call and do a live reaction to an alien masquerading as a human being called Lily Orchard. Now, this is actually not new with the two of us. We often sit and call after the streams are over and chat for a bit while Critter and Raymond go off to have dinner and become dinner respectively, but oftentimes it's just random times throughout the day when we have free time that we have these hangouts. Lately, due to Kaiser's relatively recent Lily Orchard video where he criticizes her take on Mary Sue's, we've been discussing this person. Outside of that and Lily's fanfic that honestly should land her in jail in this country, she's also really bad at media literacy. Or at least has incredibly bad takes that I feel need to be picked apart on a much deeper level than the much more off-the-cuff screaming at my friend that we've been engaging with. She's mainly known for her hot takes on cartoons, the most famous being Why Steven Universe and The Legend of Korra are garbage, respectively. I actually won't be tackling those today since I feel that that'll require much more thorough investigation and a rewatch of the series themselves to properly engage with. She's also known for her hilariously bad set of rules for writing that she posted on Twitter a number of years ago that everyone was clowning on because most of the proposed rules were just her dumb opinions and being salty about specific cartoon shows that she's been watching on her channel. The first video we'll go through is her Stop Making Villains Like Magneto, They Suck. In it, she seems to be arguing that sympathetic villains, or villains who are in any way complex or challenge the viewer or reader, are rather worthless because no one likes them. She says the fandom suffers from tunnel vision, that fandom always prefers complicated villains, yet, like I've already said, has her own myopic view of the topic by implying that classic villains are inherently better. But also, as we'll later see in this video, she actually pivots to a completely different point, where she says not only are sympathetic villains garbage, but they shouldn't actually be villains at all, regardless of the context of why they are considered villains. The fact of the matter is, because fandom isn't the monolith that Lily likes to portray it as, there are a myriad of different people who have different takes. Some people do like complicated villains and hate simplistic ones. Some people hate complicated villains. Some people like complicated villains but hate sympathetic ones, and vice versa. Some, like me, and likely a lot of you, enjoy all sorts of villains. Not Lily, though. She likes her villains simplistic, whether they actually are or not. But enough about that. Let's get on to the video proper.
So there's a sentiment among people that villains are always better when they're complicated and sympathetic. It's become a part of fandom's growing tunnel vision in that they believe that there is one objectively best set of tropes for a story, and if they can find it, then their mere presence will make the story better.
So the first sentence into the actual topic of the video doesn't sound that bad. She's talking about a, presumably, set of fandom that talks about how certain tropes in fandom are always good when present in a story and that it's annoying. I tend to agree with this, as it can be annoying when someone says something that is incredibly subjective is in actuality objective. The main problem is that she's not being clear about who is saying this. There are no examples of people saying these things, no articles showing this sentiment as a widespread belief. Yet, if you were to listen to her, you'd think that she was some sort of lone individual in a sea of NPCs with a unique opinion. She also words her sentences in a way that is hard to understand the meaning or intention behind it. This sentence makes it sound like tropes are just something that fandom has invented, and that all one has to do is just close their eyes and imagine a scenario from the shows that they consume and pretend like they found something amazing. In actuality, tropes are just recurring patterns in shows that people have noticed and sometimes have noticed to the point of graduating into cliché. Every element within a story can technically be broken down into a trope. Whether or not they need to is a different matter, because apparently there are some people who just can't think of stories without thinking of tropes. And when these people try and create stories where they just build a story from a trope, it becomes incredibly stilted because that's not actually how stories are created. An evil for the sake of evil villain is a trope, and a sympathetic or complex villain is a trope. Both can be fun, but it's kind of undeniable that you can do more things with a complex or sympathetic villain than a simplistic one. But ultimately, it depends on the story that you want to tell that determines what kind of villain that you should have in your story. A complex or sympathetic Sauron would not work as the main driving force in Lord of the Rings, yet Gollum is a much more complex villainous character, and yet just as beloved. On the other hand, a simplistic villain would not work in a story like A Song of Ice and Fire. The main driving force for most characters of that story are not the White Walkers. In fact, they're only really important to a small handful of POV characters, but rather characters like Cersei and Littlefinger, who are driven by deeper motivations of destiny, determinism, jealousy, greed, and feelings of injustice wrought upon them. Tropes are tools at the end of the day and should be treated as such. They're used for their specific purposes.
Fandom likes to believe that there is only one good kind of story to tell, they just need to find it.
Sentences side by side, she repeats herself with different wording and acts like she says something different. A tautology. See what I did there? Does it make for good video content when I do that? But no, Lily, there isn't one good story. There are 1,447, 36, 7, 6, arguably 3.
They'll always respond to criticism of a trope's execution as if it's criticism of the trope itself, and almost always repeat the line, "It works if it's done well."
I mean, yes. This time it's a logical tautology. Something succeeds when it's done well. I'm glad that we're establishing how things work. Next she'll be telling us that water is wet because it's not dry.
But fandom doesn't really think in terms of done well. If the trope is present at all, it's done well in their eyes.
Not necessarily. It depends on the person. But there's also a difference between a trope that's done well and a trope that somebody just enjoys being there. That's the important distinction. There are tropes that are present that can also be done poorly, but she doesn't mention anything like that. She doesn't go into detail about anything. She just says something and expects it to just be taken as fact. It's so frustrating. She also expects that you just automatically know what she's talking about. That's not being a good YouTuber. That's not being a good reviewer or communicator or anything.
Additionally, there's a bit of a social desirability bias in that fandom will often say that they love complicated and sympathetic villains, and yet at the same time, where their actual viewing habits are concerned, their favorite villains tend to be far less complicated.
I'm calling bullshit. Most likely that this is an instance where someone enjoys both, but Lily is also using Maleficent as an example. Maleficent is a classic villain in a fairy tale story, where villains like that work well. It's not a matter of a social bias so much as a nostalgic factor. Nobody is looking at... what are their names? Atticus or Marcus from Rebel Moon as great and memorable villains. Nobody gives a shit about Malekith from Thor: The Dark World, but people still talk about and heavily reference the more complex Thanos. This isn't to say that simplistic villains cannot be done today. Hela and Ego are good examples of well-liked simplistic villains from the Marvel Universe, to continue with this trend example. But even if they are adaptations of villains from older comics. Besides, who are you to say what a person does or does not like? If someone is gushing about a complex villain on their Tumblr, Twitter, or Instagram, they're going to be honest about liking that villain. Are people making such contradictory posts? Screenshots or didn't happen.
I'm guilty of that too. My favorite villains are the opposite of complicated or sympathetic. They're very simple megalomaniacs and don't have an ounce of sympathy in their dry, brittle bones.
Ugh. This is going to be a recurring thing later on when we get into her takes about Kingdom Hearts, where even if she likes something, she doesn't understand it. Now, I don't know what the heck the character on the right is, and a quick search on Copilot revealed nothing, because the one type of thing that I'd want to use it for proves to be worthless. How wonderful. But the bald old man is the main villain of Kingdom Hearts, Xehanort. He's basically Thanos. It takes a while for us to understand who Xehanort is and what he wants, but his goals are effectively incredibly similar to Thanos. We slowly learn more and more about his motivations from his first introduction in Kingdom Hearts 2, his pure introduction in Birth by Sleep, and culminates in the nuanced aspect of his goal in Kingdom Hearts 3. Then we learn why he became the way he did in the prequel story Dark Road. Xehanort in Kingdom Hearts 2 sees him studying the heart and looks to bring darkness into the world through human experimentation. Prior to that in Birth by Sleep, he talks about wanting to relieve the world from the tyranny of light, which may or may not be a double entendre, as we learn many things are in the Kingdom Hearts series, and that darkness is not necessarily something to be feared as completely evil. In order for the world to be better, light and darkness need to be in balance with one another. He seeks to understand why darkness is feared, to understand it and his pursuits in seeking the answers to darkness, and to find a perfect equilibrium. He causes many of the harms in order to reach what he believes is a better solution. Effectively, he sacrifices and is cruel to a few people in order to make a peaceful world in the end. Eventually, though, he comes to understand that his ultimate goals are unachievable as long as people exist in the world as they are. So instead, he seeks to reset the world, turn it into a blank canvas, and rid the sins and mistakes of this current version of the world. In Birth by Sleep and Kingdom Hearts 3, we learn that Xehanort had an interest in the events of Kingdom Hearts Union Cross. But it's in Dark Road we see that it's actually an obsession. Having shared memories with the reincarnation of the player character from Union Cross, Xehanort feels Ephemer and the other characters in the part of the game are his friends that he knows dearly but has never met. He seeks to find them, and along the way, he and his classmates are besieged by darkness, and eventually all of them are killed until only he and one friend are left alive, with him ending the life of the one friend that succumbed to darkness. This pain and loneliness effectively broke him and drove him further to seek out the friends from his dreams and hope to save them if he couldn't save his classmates, to learn, to understand, to conquer. To figure out why his friends were slaughtered, and for no one else to ever go through that pain again, he sought to understand why darkness becomes more powerful the closer one is to light, and to find a way to fill the world with more darkness to inoculate people from that fate. Lily tells us Xehanort has no empathy in his
dry, brittle bones.
But the game goes out of its way to explicitly tell us he became that way because he has too much empathy. None of this makes for a simplistic villain, and it just goes to show that Lily doesn't pay attention because dialogue that's much more nuanced than a Saturday morning cartoon about ponies is too complicated for her. Then again, given her track record, maybe that's also wrong. I didn't watch Friendship is Magic. Anyway, we might have established that Lily either doesn't understand that she also likes complex villains or doesn't understand when a villain is complicated or not, and goes based off of what she personally enjoys and calls that simple, and doesn't enjoy and calls that complex. In which case it's pretty worthless when talking to anyone who isn't herself.
But I also have a documented dislike of stories that try to make their villain sympathetic. Why? Well, let's answer that question in an increasingly roundabout route for the sake of audience metrics. See, sympathetic villains are a double-edged sword.
I've already established why that's a lie. But I do want to say that this is a good opportunity to talk about why it's usually frustrating to listen to Lily, because she does what's known as a gish gallop. She says a bunch of nonsense things in quick succession so rapidly that it's hard to fully grasp everything that she says and doesn't fully sink in properly. It's like she has some sort of fear that if she talks too much, that she'll make a video too long or something and perish the thought of that happening.
Because you can only make them so sympathetic before their status as a villain starts to be questioned.
This isn't entirely incorrect, but there's a wide gap between a sympathetic villain and a sympathetic strawman. The line sometimes blurs, but it's still a fairly solid and well-defined line.
Let's take my all-time favorite example of this backfiring, Magneto. Now, Magneto is the main villain of X-Men, a story about the persecution of people who have a genetic mutation that gives them superpowers. It's a very dated metaphor for racism in the 60s, and the films are a very dated metaphor for LGBT youth in the 2000s.
First of all, the X-Men was never originally conceived as a metaphor for racism or any other maligned group by the original creators of the story to any large degree. It wasn't until another writer came about that the metaphor really struck home. But dated? Dated. A story from the 60s being contemporary to the 60s is not goddamn dated, Lily. The X-Men have always been a story about mutants being hated and feared for their powers. Even if we all got bored with the metaphor and said let's strip all of the baggage, in the end it's still fundamentally a story about superpowered beings fighting to not be seen as monsters for having powers. That was always there, intentional metaphors or not. Even then, it's apparently illegal to enjoy stories that were developed before the modern day without criticizing them for not being contemporary enough. Wow, a movie from the year 2000 when LGBT people like yourself were still highly persecuted and not allowed to have marriage performed was contemporary to the politics of the current decade? Color me shocked. How dare these movies deal with contemporary issues in the year that they were produced? Do people who think like this honestly believe the things that are actually acceptable and the ways people go about thinking and doing activism now is how they were done decades ago? Because it's not. You kinda had to work your way up to this point, for better or for worse.
Magneto's whole shtick is that he's a Jewish Holocaust survivor who sees the impending discrimination against mutants as another Holocaust waiting to happen, and is determined to not let it happen even if he has to get violent to do it. Now, your first thought upon reading up on Magneto's backstory and motivation is probably, hang on, why is he a villain again?
Because it's called a terrorist, Lily. It doesn't matter if someone's motivations for doing what they do is good if they terrorize and slaughter innocent people to do it. Magneto doesn't give a shit about non-mutants, and he sees every single one of them as no better than Nazis. He probably saw every single German citizen that way too, regardless of whether they were in open support, in tentative ignorance, or in open opposition to the regime. What makes Magneto a villain isn't what he wants to accomplish, but the lengths he goes to in order to accomplish it. And I know that there's a growing movement lately of people who are perfectly okay with accomplishing something by any means necessary because it's their personal beliefs and perhaps themselves that directly benefit. And I know for a fact that it seems from this video at the very least that Lily is one of those people. Unfortunately. So it's easy to unperson other human beings as long as you see them as the villain. Dehumanization is unfortunately a very real thing and is used in many ways to accomplish great crimes and atrocities for any reason throughout history. That's why it's such a chilling and effective thing to tack onto your fictional bad guy. Villains are evil for this reason and quite often don't see themselves as such.
This was, for a very long time, a pretty fucking massive glaring issue with the comics. You have a Holocaust survivor seeing the signs of genocide creeping in and goes, oh fuck that noise, and is trying to stop it, and he's the bad guy.
Yes, Lily. He's the bad guy because he sees signs and immediately goes full divide and conquer, instead of working with his allies to mitigate and educate. Those who have experienced trauma often become hypersensitive to anything remotely resembling the cause, and that's not always healthy. Survival tactics are meant for survival, not thriving, and Magneto and his ilk are the excuse needed to justify further persecution of mutants.
Magneto's new-ish backstory is pretty bog-standard sympathetic villain fodder. Namely, heroes plead to the moral sensibilities of an oppressor, and trying to end systemic discrimination by force is a bad, naughty thing for meanie-poos.
Another good example of Lily not understanding nuance. But also a good example of how she always downplays complex social issues to some playground scrap. That it's just two kids fighting in the sandbox and it should be okay to beat up the other kid because he took your shovel. And to suggest that doing anything else but to beat the kid's face in is the better option is just you taking the thief's side. Become the bully to bully the bullies. Violence should be the first option, never the last, because everything in Lily's eyes should be seen as the most dramatically important issue. There are always other options, arguably better, that gain favor with the public or civil liberties. The master of magnetism himself could have done so many things to make mutants appealing to the common public. But no, his first step was genocide, and Lily agrees with what Magneto does. I just find it absolutely disgusting that Lily thinks that trying to come to a peaceful conclusion and treating someone who disagrees with you like a human being is considered the dumb option. There's a lot of talk in fandoms about shows with racial discrimination undertones that tries to emphasize that activists don't need to try and win over the hearts and minds of the regular people, and that they instead need to be the ones to stop living their lives and dedicate their energy into doing something that doesn't benefit them in any way, so that the activists don't have to try and do anything difficult or have to struggle. How does that make any sense? It's a completely backwards thought process to think that an activist just needs to sit on their butt and verbally spank people and that's their activism, and that the regular average person has to be the one to do the heavy lifting to convince themselves that their thoughts and attitudes are wrong. I'm sorry, but if a genuinely bigoted person is confronted with this, they'll laugh in your face. This only works on people who are already agreeable to your socio-political mindset. That isn't to say that violence is never an option, but that should always be the last resort, not the first, not the second. As though treating a group that you consider your oppressors with a level of political care in order to ease them into better accepting you isn't the smart thing to do when you think that that group is actively endangering your life. I know when I'm faced with a serial killer pointing a gun at my head, the first thing I do is tell them that they must have impotency issues and their wife left them. That'll surely not bother them at all and keep me alive. It's easy to talk big when the opponent is unarmed. It's easy to talk big when you don't actually care about many people getting caught in the crossfire, as long as you ultimately succeed in the end. Again, this is what makes a villain regardless of what motivations make them understandable.
If this does not scream tacit support of the status quo to you, you're clearly not paying attention.
No. This screams of a petulant child who is too impatient to play the long game because they want things now. I'm sorry that societal change takes time, but you shouldn't start a fucking war over it. I'm talking the scale and level of danger here, and more broadly the mentality of people like Lily, who think that starting a fist fight is the answer to the word no, regardless of context. War is not always preventable, but you should still try, dang it. The X-Men do not fight for the status quo. They are actively out there trying to change people's minds in a positive way, through showing their humanity and protecting the weak, not trying to make humans subservient or hitting them with a stick until you're sure they won't bite back.
And this framework has existed all the way up to the modern day, where even though Magneto has long since stopped being a villain in the comics, in film adaptations, he's still a Holocaust survivor, and still the bad guy for no reason.
Lily, do you expect that the movie should just continue on from the comics? Is that what I'm getting from this? Of course Magneto is the villain in the movie's own separate continuity that merely takes inspiration from the comics. Especially a movie where Magneto is much younger and the memories of his childhood is much fresher in his mind.
Never again.
You know, never again is a real thing that real Holocaust survivors say all the time, and here it's repurposed into a declaration of villainy.
You gotta love how she twists and mangles things to fit her narrative. Magneto in the film was talking about how he fears a repeat of the Holocaust and thus a forsaking of Charles's ideals and mentality, an establishment of their relationship going forward for decades to come. It's a rejection, not a declaration. God, it's not like most of the movie wasn't about this very thing or something.
His big moment of turning to evil is killing a fucking Nazi.
God, I hope I don't have to keep stopping every sentence going forward, but Lily just keeps being a dumbass because it's so much more in vogue to just treat everything as black and white. The very thing she whined and bitched about at the very beginning of the video. But it's okay to do it when it's something you agree with. It's a rejection, like I said before. This time not of Charles, he's already done that. He's rejecting letting go and moving on. He's rejecting a new life in favor of perpetual victimhood, revenge over peace of mind, anger over closure. Lily is looking at what's on the surface and acting like that's all there is to it, and wondering why what Eric is doing is such a bad thing. Also, keep in mind that this whole time, Charles is keeping Shaw frozen by using his powers on him. Charles, his friend, is connected to Shaw's mind, and Eric knows that and still chooses to take advantage of Shaw being frozen to kill him. Charles is screaming not just because he doesn't want Shaw to be killed, but also because he can feel the coin as though it's passing through his own brain. By threatening the Navy, killing Shaw, and going outside of the law, Eric has established that mutants are an actual threat, therefore sealing his own fate and the fate of mutants everywhere in stone. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's the tragedy of his character.
Actually, fuck. You know that one Ultron line I keep using?
I think you're confusing peace with quiet.
But here's the great thing about that. That's a real thing that someone said when talking about the kind of attitude expressed by characters like Charles Xavier. Just to put the cherry on top, it was said by the person that people keep saying Charles Xavier is an allegory for.
You disingenuous quote-mining little vermin. Not only did you manipulate your video to make it seem like Ultron was essentially quoting MLK, But you made it seem like the line Ultron said was in the ballpark of the same ideal in order to attack people who, in my mind, have the rational stance that violence isn't the answer to all your problems. MLK was talking about a subset of people who don't want to rock the boat, who think that just because violence isn't happening means that everything is pretty much perfect and either don't contribute to helping fight for social issues or actively fight to maintain the status quo despite speaking hollow words of support in order to maintain the veneer of harmony. That thus spirals into a negative feedback loop when groups that require support don't get it and run out of options but to become violent. Ultron was talking about the cyclical nature of humanity's tendency to constantly be at war with one another. Thor talked about maintaining the peace and not starting a war. Ultron doesn't see it as peace, but merely a lull between bouts of battle. There's a massive difference between talking about people who turn a blind eye to maintain the illusion of peace on a smaller social issue and thinking that a product of larger social-political breakdowns are the natural state of humanity, and that peace is just a temporary sabbatical from that. Also, the equivalent to that quote in the X-Men universe that MLK is referring to would be people who don't give a shit about mutants, despite claiming that they fully support them. Not people like Charles.
The problem with a sympathetic villain is that you can only make them so sympathetic before the fact that they're a villain at all reflects extremely poorly on you as a writer. You can only throw so much sympathy onto them before it becomes a question of why they're a villain in the first place.
I agree to a certain extent, but as I've already demonstrated many times, it depends on context. It also depends on how the writers write the villains in comparison to the heroes that determines whether they become a sympathetic hero or a strawman. Effectively, the writers need to have an awareness and understanding of what it is that they're writing about in order to show how the villain's logic or methodology is flawed compared to the heroes. When the writers don't have this awareness, that makes for a strawman villain, but that is not what Magneto is. Just because you don't pay attention to anything outside of the surface text doesn't mean the subtext isn't there.
In RWBY, the main villains are essentially anti-racism protesters who have a very good reason to be anti-racism protesters. They're such a thinly veiled allegory for real-life civil rights activists, and the point where they become villainous is so nakedly shallow and so pathetically self-protective on the part of the writers that it's almost a joke.
Will I ever be free from RWBY? Well, the company is shutting down, and as of writing this script, there is no buyer for the franchise in sight, so fingers crossed. But oh boy, here we go. So, I agree that the White Fang are a bad analogy for the civil rights movement, and that's down to a myriad of factors ranging from the writers were too ambitious for their skill level, something that they themselves admitted years later, to paying no real attention to something that is incredibly nuanced and complicated like fighting for equality. They were so desperate to mimic X-Men and the issues it tackled that they forgot that X-Men is a franchise in and of itself. Not a subplot running around in the background to Marvel's Fantastic Four, Captain America, and Incredible Hulk's comics. Like, yes, these comics all share the same universe as each other and often do overlap, but they aren't relegated to background characters only. They have their own stories that run side by side to these other stories with occasional butting heads and team-ups. The White Fang is terrible because we're introduced to the concept of them as terrorists, and we get told later on that they're civil rights protesters, but here's the thing. Protesters don't steal private property. Protesters don't use weapons or form alliances with other terrorist groups. The White Fang are also literally the only group out there actively fighting for the human rights of Faunus, and we don't see an individual from that group that is non-violent until Volume 4. There's also no active pushback when anyone says that the White Fang are terrorists, except for the ex-White Fang member who literally left because they were becoming too much like violent terrorists, and only outed herself because her ego was bruised when someone else said it out loud. We don't see the White Fang do anything that isn't criminal grunt work throughout all 9 volumes of the show's incredibly drawn-out run. Hell, they aren't even a factor after Volume 5. Nor do we see why the White Fang is even a movement to begin with. We see barely anything about how the Faunus are treated. We're just told about it by a small group of people standing around talking to each other on the front steps of a prestigious school. Being terrorists and wanting to enforce change through violence does not make you sympathetic. Being violent through self-defense is one thing, But active violence is something completely different.
Or at least it would be if the reason for writing them this way wasn't painfully obvious. The two writers are extremely sheltered white guys who think systemic racism is over, individual racists are the only real problem, and protesters are just assholes for inconveniencing them personally.
Says the white bitch. Lily, Miles is part Mexican, and I'm pretty sure he has more ethnic color in him than you do, you 1/16th Cherokee hypocrite. Being part of a minority group, either through cultural history or distant blood relation, doesn't mean that you automatically know a damn thing about anything. It just means that you have a tangential connection. I heavily dislike Miles and Carrie as writers, but I wouldn't say something so disgusting and malicious as to say that they're pathetically self-protective. You don't know their lives or their history or what things they went through. I don't believe in the concept of own voices in fiction. Just because you went through something or had a particular experience doesn't mean that you have the ability or skill to write about it. Just because someone has never experienced something personally doesn't mean that they can't go through research into the topic in order to properly portray it. The issue is whether or not the writer did their due diligence on the topic, and we can safely say that Miles and Carrie did not. There's a lot of people who try and defend this terrible decision by claiming that the first 3 to 4 volumes with the White Fang were to show a movement being co-opted by a malicious force, which is all fine and dandy except for the fact that we never saw it not co-opted, and that's the issue. It was rotten from the very beginning, and as green writers, they didn't notice. Also, I'd like to point out that Monty was alive for the first 2 years of Ruby's run. You know, that guy. The creator of the series. Despite him not being credited as a writer, he would still have to approve of everything and endorse how things went or come up with the roots of the story ideas himself. But, you know, he's Asian, so it's not as easy to pick on Monty and mock him for his skin color. Lily is also denying the impact that racism is on the whole, either legacy or on an individual basis. And I say legacy because systemic is a loaded term, often used to rile people up into an emotional frenzy, and ends up muddying issues. I don't think anyone really denies the idea that there are racial elements in parts of certain systems, but they're more likely remnants of a bygone era that need to be surgically removed and mended, not hacked away with a machete and a vengeance. By focusing so much on the idea of systemic elements, it ignores the harm that individuals can cause, and how navigating individuals can in some ways be trickier than a legacy or systemic issue. You can easily change a system with some hard work and elbow grease, but you can't brute force someone's mind to change. And individuals can enforce and perpetuate a system or legacy issue, putting you back to square one. So by hand-waving racism on an individual basis as being more or less harmless, Lily is being blind to a big aspect of what makes tackling racism so difficult. By condoning the actions of sympathetic villainous characters whose actions are effectively beating people into submission until they're too afraid to argue back, intentionally or not, she comes off as endorsing a viewpoint that the current system is okay as long as the script is flipped in their favor. These concepts are usually simplified for fiction, as to do otherwise is too complicated for a writer or even a small team of writers to handle efficiently, while still making a story digestible and comprehensive. But Lily here just wants to remove all complexities, all nuance, and all elements that don't conform to her incredibly simplistic outlook. Once again, despite complaining at the beginning of the video about people's lack of nuance. I'm skipping Lily's screed here about how much she hates the idea of people can go too far because honestly, it makes sense that she'd personally think this way. It makes too much sense that somebody like her subscribed to the idea that as long as someone has what could be considered a justifiable excuse, that they can get away with horrible atrocities and no one should criticize them for it. It's absolutely gross. It's not like we have rules and laws that we made up because we have to deal with other human beings in the world and thus have to agree upon things like how far is too far and all that. Or that it doesn't make for good fiction to explore an element like that, or hell, that real people don't grapple with this very concept in the real world.
Why is the leader of the White Fang a villain? Because he doesn't want equality, he just wants to kill all the humans. That's a line of thought that doesn't make sense unless you believe this about real-life civil rights protesters. If you're someone who thinks anti-racist is code for anti-white, this is the only through line in which the White Fang as a villain makes sense.
No. Only an insane person would think that. Jesus fucking Christ, do you not understand the concept of the difference between reality and fiction? Do you think that Magneto and Charles are meant to be literal representations of MLK and Malcolm X? That most people think that because Magneto killed thousands of people in the comics and intended to kill more in order to get his way, that meant Malcolm X intended to do the same? Absolutely not. Fiction is exaggerated, Lily. In these cases where a person goes too far and isn't an outright evil human being, they're a cautionary tale, meant to warn people that anyone has the ability to cross the line into heinous territory and justify atrocities with flowery excuses. No human being is immune to that. Ugh. I'm sorry, I'm skipping over the examples because I haven't watched Korra since it aired.
Almost every season it's like, this is an interesting concept to explore in regards to how the world of Avatar works and how the people there have to live their daily lives.
Oh, no! No, she did not say that while showing a clip of the fascist dictator politicking her fascism around. Oh my god! Lily! Lily, no! Lily, bad! Ah!
It's so nakedly obvious just how protective of the status quo these stories are, and this is the problem with sympathetic villains. Civil rights activists trying to overthrow an unjust status quo are right to do so. It is the morally correct position.
Listen to this real-life supervillain speaking. Oh my god, my head hurts. Where do I even begin with this insane nonsense? Lily makes a lot of assumptions here, first of all. Big assumptions outside of the obvious one that these fictional activists are always justified merely because they assume a sympathetic cause. One of the assumptions made is that the individuals participating in a coup d'etat are always going to have purely noble intentions, and that the resulting change, no matter what happens, is always going to be better because the coup will automatically force everyone to comply with the demands of the conspirators. The fact of the matter is, in real life, coups are a lot messier than that, and can result in a myriad of different outcomes, only a handful of which are better than what was there before. Half of all attempts fail, and of those that succeed, form some kind of dictatorship, with some ending in autocracy or democracy. Often the coup is merely a changing of hands, shuffling of individuals while the structure itself doesn't change. But many coups cause civil unrest and economic, societal, and political instability, not just for the country the coup happened in, but also neighboring countries. Personally, I wouldn't want to risk what the future might hold with a government in which a person like Magneto, during his peak mwahaha phase, would be like for those that he doesn't personally favor. Even then, there's no guarantee conditions for the downtrodden peoples the coup was meant to help would actually be helped by overthrowing the government due to potential civil unrest and instabilities I earlier mentioned. But the problem with forcing something to change when a country isn't ready is that you aren't making it so that things will be better for the vulnerable people. You'll just make things that they go through happen underground, in secret. In order for something to truly be successful, you have to convince the people, not just change the law. That's not even getting into the potential structural damage that may be caused by the battle to get there. Coups are rarely bloodless, with silent or peaceful coups happening on occasion, but the case of a violent coup, like what would happen in a dramatized fictional scenario like this, could lead to full-out revolutionary wars that will need time and money to fix the damage to structures and infrastructure after the dust is cleared. We don't have to look far into our history to see that coups like those in Africa and the likes of Fidel Castro had on countries that they happened in. When it comes to villain characters like these, the outcome is likely to lean more toward that than any utopian outcome because of the very nature of them being villains. They go too far. That isn't to say that exploring scenarios like these aren't interesting, but the individual who writes them would have to tread incredibly carefully and justify reasonably every decision moving forward, the successes and failures of characters, and especially the consequences of their actions, for better or for worse. Many characters likely don't feel like they have the ability to write something like that in a mature and nuanced manner, so don't want to touch it, even if they wanted to write a story like that in the first place. There are plenty of movies, TV shows, and novels where the protagonists are some downtrodden, oppressed group who fight against big government, corporation, or regime. But these stories aren't those. I feel like Lily would enjoy those better since she seems to only like one kind of story, with one set of conclusions, and can't appreciate why different circumstances and scenarios would lead to otherwise similar groups of people and stories to be considered good or bad. What I'm trying to get at here is, who is Lily? Born and raised in Canada, one of the safest, most stable and privileged countries in the world, know about the gravity and magnitude about what it takes to be so desperate as to need to pull off a major upheaval like this. There's a reason why the successful fictional stories like this are set in some sort of dystopia, because the desperation needs to match the situation or risk the characters coming off as entitled brats. Writing is often a delicate dance of blending realism with fiction, themes and motives and consequences, and above all, showing why it's necessary or important for the characters to pursue this method over less potentially bloody and violent methods. Any writer worth their salt will acknowledge this to some degree, even if they don't exclusively focus on it. Yet, here Lily is, blundering her way through this very heavy and intricate topic with all the care of a bull in a china shop, yet is claiming that what she says is a solution to the problems of scenarios like this. Magneto and Amon are really bad examples for what Lily is ultimately complaining about. The idea that a disadvantaged or oppressed group of people should be seen as the villains for wanting to make their lives better. This mainly comes down to the funny little thing that Lily doesn't want you to focus on again. Nuance. Magneto is a mutant, and as much as we, the audience, knows that mutants are just normal people who want to live their lives and are used as an allegory for oppressed real-life groups of people, they are ultimately just that, allegories. At some point, a fictionalized comparison between a normal human being who has more melanin than you or gets horny for someone that you don't, and someone who has the ability to cause magnitude 9 earthquakes if they're having a bad day at work is going to break down. Humans have a legitimate reason to potentially be afraid of mutants, which is why it's important for the X-Men to do outreach and show their humanity to the regular people who will eventually be acclimated and accustomed to having mutants in their lives, and to see them as people rather than nebulous threats. Amon, on the other hand, even taking away the twist that he's actually a bender, lives in a multicultural city of different benders from all over the world and claims that non-benders are oppressed by benders for having the ability to do things like move elements in a way that non-benders can't. These are diametrically opposite to one another, despite Lily's claims that they are effectively the same thing. Magneto, a superpowered being, is claiming that non-superpowered beings are dangerous and we must get them before they get us. While Amon is a non-superpowered being who is saying that superpowered beings are oppressing them. The X-Men live in a world where there is a threat of a fictionalized conversion therapy in the way of a mutant suppressant that is seen as a bad thing in both the story narrative and from the perspective of the audience, X-Men, and the Brotherhood of Mutants alike. In Legend of Korra, Amon has the ability to energy bend and lock the chakras in a way to suppress bending in a fictionalized version of conversion therapy that is meant to be seen as a bad thing in both the story narrative and from the perspective of the audience and the new Team Avatar. Only one of these things is treated as a bad thing by Lily.
A victim of abuse, torture, or rape trying to kill her abuser in vengeance is right to do so.
Interesting.
And making these characters hop in the giant death robot so they can randomly do some heinous act of evil so you feel less guilty for wanting to bring them down is very telling about your priorities as a writer.
I hate this mentality. This idea that everything the writer does is automatically because they believe something or hold particular politics or have this or that fetish or whatever. People can write for more than their personal interests. Stories can go beyond who the author is as a person and more than what the author thinks or believes. There's no rule that says an author can only ever write stories that fit into their personal belief systems. People have the ability to write and create things that they have an interest in creating without personally having to be invested in it in one way or another. I don't like how AI is changing the artistic landscape and push to constantly have machines do everything in place of humanity because rich people are greedy and paying people for their labor is icky. But I can still write a romance story about a human and a humanoid AI robot and the struggle to get that robot to be seen as a human being. My potential writing of that fictional scenario is not carte blanche and endorsement of unrestricted AI infecting everything. Author Mick Writingson can write a story about a boy fighting against a political system in his dystopian society while himself potentially being for said system. Just because we tend to like writing about things that we know and like doesn't mean that we're restricted to it. And Lily's assumption that just because a writer puts something into their story, she can twist it into her own demented mind to have it say something about the author themselves is just unbelievably ignorant. Especially since Lily has demonstrated how she distorts plots, scenes, and motivations to fit her ideals.
You need them to hop into the death robot, because without them doing that, nobody else would be on board with this crap.
I'm pretty sure most of us were against Kuvira long before she revealed her giant robot.
I find Season 4 of Korra was probably the most telling, because early on the notion that Kuvira was tyrannical was kinda up in the air. Even Korra wasn't on board with immediately smoking her. Everything she was supposedly doing was rumors.
A lovely demonstration that Lily doesn't follow context clues. Wow, you mean a story about a dictator has rumors about the terrible things they've done might be a clue to said dictator's true intentions and goals? The fact that the subject is suspicious and that we all should put the viewer on edge and wary of the character? Nah, can't be. That's impossible, it's so up in the air and vague. Skipping more of this BS because this is now just the ranting more about Legend of Korra video now. Jesus, Lily, make a new terrible video about it if you aren't done ranting. God. She's just mad in this part of the video because she hates the main characters for upholding the status quo and doesn't like that the show doesn't criticize them for being goody two-shoes. Watch a different show.
I guess that would have struck a little too close to home for these two white guys.
You know, criticisms like this are incredibly toothless coming from the likes of you, white Canadian person. And yes, practically everything about you is white. Even with your native ancestry, which I hear is incredibly slight, you do nothing to learn about the traditions of the culture, but you love the benefits of acting like you somehow have a leg to criticize people for their skin color and the location they live in. God, you just love being a stereotype of what the right thinks the left is, don't you? Unbelievable.
You see the problem, right? Sympathetic villains only work under a very particular framework, and that framework is about as moral and ethical as the fucking Lich King.
No, you're just too dense to understand nuances. Lily likes repeating herself, but I'm not gonna.
If you're someone who thinks civil rights protesters go too far when they're disruptive, they aren't the villains of that story. You are.
No, we're not. Having dealt with a bunch of protesters in the last 5 years concerning pipelines in my area, disrupting trains that bring food into the town, threatening to starve us out in order to get their way, often in defiance of or outright ignoring the people that they are claiming to represent, I can safely say that protesters can be villains without being fictional. There is a lot of talk about how protesters came here from the bougie-ass areas of Ontario and Quebec. Provinces that barely acknowledge the existence of provinces west or north of themselves until it benefits them, and disrupt the lives and threaten the health and safety of entire towns of people, including the villages of the natives that they wanted to help, many of which didn't even want them there in the first place. See, this is the problem with performative activism. They don't care about people they hurt, or if they also hurt the people that they're claiming to help. All they care about is the brownie points, the idea that they can go home at night with the warm fuzzies in their chest, all self-righteous and smug. I also hated the protest the truckers started that was co-opted by anti-vaxxers and other alt-right groups and caused a lot of vandalization and stress for people who were already dealing with the same shit the protesters were, simply because they couldn't handle being under the same pressure anymore. It came off as incredibly selfish, and my support for them quickly went out the window after they overstayed their welcome. And yeah, I gave examples on both sides of the political spectrum to show that this isn't a one-sided thing. Causing other people extended grief isn't a good way to get them on your side in a political or social issue. Nobody likes being forced into your holy war. That's not even counting bombings or other terrorist acts in the name of some cause or whatever. Not to mention the fact that I bet that she only says this about social issues that she's personally invested in. There are a lot of social issues that are diverse and unpopular, but other people are invested in and passionate about. They likely feel oppressed and victimized, but I doubt Lily would agree that they deserve to get this kind of treatment because she doesn't agree with it or doesn't care.
The problem with this can work if it's done well is that this in and of itself is not a trope. This is the end result of using tropes badly.
Wow, another repeated tautology. Wow, Lily, you mean if something is done well, then it's done well? And if it's something that's not done well, it's not done well? Color me shocked. Imagine my surprise. What does she mean by this in and of itself is not a trope? Everything within fiction is a trope, so by definition, yes, it would be.
If you did it well to begin with, it wouldn't have ended up like this.
Oh, she just means that if you did it in the way that she likes it, which completely changed the story into something fundamentally different, like into V for Vendetta or Snowpiercer, she wouldn't have anything to complain about. Silly me. It's not whether or not a particular element of a trope is done well or poorly, it's whether or not it fits into her own political standards of good and evil, and that makes something succeed or fail in the story narrative.
Let's workshop. Doing the trope of anti-oppression group as antagonist well is understanding how this actually works in real life, so the villainy has to come from propaganda. Kind of like exactly what this style of villain is in the first place. It's propaganda, so that when you see this, you will connect it with this. It's propaganda. It's literal fucking propaganda.
She's not entirely wrong here, but you cannot make an entire series where the main villain is propaganda. Propaganda is a tool that's used to make people think the way someone wants you to think. Someone has to be behind the propaganda, but anyone can use propaganda. It's not just the tool of those in power, or those who are considered evil. It just means that those in power can wield it more effectively. A villainous person like Magneto can use more underground methods of spreading propaganda to get mutants on his side, as an example. But Lily doesn't want activists or people with a genuine grievance to be an antagonistic, let alone villainous force in any story, so I'm sure that she wouldn't approve of that happening. She doesn't want to have better written stories, and that's why she's making this video to criticize a particular trope and its usual execution. She wants to stifle it altogether. Her desire would be to take the idea of someone becoming too radicalized off the docket as antagonistic and villainize anyone who fights for that radicalization to not terrorize the population.
The struggle for liberation and equality is immediately, the moment you think about it, the morally correct side of the argument. The real villain is the status quo itself and those who enforce it.
This whole time, Lily has been talking about radical activism and opposition to radical activism as this black and white thing by downplaying or outright ignoring the fact that radicalization in and of itself is what is being portrayed as bad. If you fight for a just cause, you should be allowed to do whatever you like. Destabilize the country if you need to, it's all good. Whatever is necessary. That's why Lily talks about opposition not as defending people from a different form of tyranny, but as defending the status quo. She'd never admit that the X-Men are also activists who fight against oppression, but in a way that's different from Magneto. She'd never mention that Cora has the power to and has been shown to alleviate some of these issues, but just in a way that doesn't disrupt anything in a way that Lily would approve of. On some level, she wants anarchy and the punishment of people who just want to go about living their lives because they aren't downtrodden enough or privileged enough to work for a change. She says that activism isn't good enough if the end goal isn't to tear society to pieces.
And so the third act twist for the protagonist is that they've been lied to, that they've been supporting an oppressive status quo, and that makes them the bad guy. Plot twist, the totally relatable main hero you can project onto, is the one getting the redemption arc, and is actually going to redeem themselves by switching sides completely.
It's not like these stories can't be made, but these stories aren't those stories. Watch those stories instead. Oh, but most stories that deal with these themes tend to be live action, and I don't know if you like those very much. Many of them also tend to be dramatizations of real historical events. Lily acts like just because these stories in particular she's complaining about don't have the elements that she happens to like or want, that those stories basically don't exist. That just because an author or director makes one type of content that they must do it as propaganda. It's like she thinks of humans as the very cartoon villains she watches. A person can't make one type of story without condoning it. If a movie director creates a cowboy movie, they must secretly want the world to return to the simple good old days, where everyone carried guns and rode horses in the desert and black people and women were oppressed. It can't just be that the majority of westerns were made by people who grew up with those movies and have nostalgia for them and want to relive that nostalgia and bring that joy to a new generation. No, it must be nefarious. If you make a sci-fi like Star Trek, you can't possibly also make a modern office comedy.
Oh my god, guys, don't watch the Flintstones, you'll become a creationist. Jeez, why am I like this?
That's the only way anti-oppression group as antagonist works. It's the only way a sympathetic villain works at all.
It's really not. She has such a reductionist, myopic view of what storytelling is and can be. Guys, it's so frustrating. Stories can only be this way. That's the only way to make a story good. It's not about the quality of a theme or a trope's execution, it's whether the trope is good or not at all.
Because any sensible writer would have looked at your outline and gone, wait, why aren't these guys the main characters?
No. Because a sensible writer knows that a good story isn't just the story they personally like for either personal or political reasons, and anything else is bad writing. People have different tastes and preferences, and there are many ways that people can be good or bad person, and sometimes those things overlap. The idea of struggling with what to do, which is the right choice, whether or not you've made mistakes, and the lengths people go to in either direction to achieve their desires are fundamental elements of storytelling. But Lily doesn't see it that way. She only sees stories, ironically, in a corporate way. How can stories benefit me and my political beliefs? A story is only good insofar as it capitulates to my personal views and expressions. Lily and I are very different people. She seems like the kind of person who sees art as a means to an end, a tool for politics and propaganda that uses this two-party good and evil way of thinking, where a story is either good or bad depending on what is being portrayed on screen. Meanwhile, I'm much more of a person who is here for art for the sake of the art. Have the enjoyment of a well-executed tried-and-true plot, the excitement of an idea or an expression that I've never thought of before, the emotions as I felt to struggle through the empathy of the character's pain and suffering, and how a difficult decision or scenario or plot twist affects my heart. To a certain extent, there is always going to be a certain level of expectation or something to go in a certain direction. But I'd never be so close-minded as to see an inversion or lampshade or twist or even simply a tried-and-true story convention as something inherently bad because it doesn't meet my personal criteria of what makes me happy. Whether something is done well or not should be weighed by a combination of personal experience and comparison to how other films, books, or shows you enjoyed did it and see how it stacks up. Then, whether or not it does, see if you can figure out why it succeeds or fails.
You can't make the anti-oppression group the bad guys unless you sincerely believe that being anti-oppression is bad. And if you do believe that, then you are bad.
But people don't believe these things, Lily. God, I hate how much she repeats herself in this video, and I'm sure going forward there's going to be a lot of repetition there too. I'm sorry if I'm repeating a lot of things myself. It's absolutely insane to me just how much she doesn't understand that fiction can just be fiction, and that anyone who writes a book or a show doesn't have to be doing it because they believe it's true. But even then, even if the writer did, Lily would still be wrong because she's so bad faith with her interpretation and how that must look on the writer.
The problem is that this idea of all villainy being nuanced and complicated has just never really been true.
Oh my god, she's going to make a case from the perspective of someone looking at the outcome of a conflict, isn't she? If something succeeded, then it's automatically good. If something failed, then it was bad and evil and stinky.
Evil people in real life will often just invent justifications for evil things they already wanted to do, and there's a point where someone crosses the line of evil so much that nothing they say earns them sympathy.
History is told by the victors, Lily. The reason why evil and villainy in fiction is often portrayed in the modern day with nuance is because real people can be complicated. Those that triumph in the end often get seen as the correct ones, and in the rare occasion that it's acknowledged that it actually wasn't, the acknowledgement is usually decades or centuries later. Do you think Mary Mallon was the evil Maleficent type who went around spreading typhoid fever on purpose? No. She happened to have an immunity where she showed no visible signs of infection and thus never believed that she was infected. She spent years evading the authorities, thinking that they were out to get her and lock her up because they were big bad government, when in reality they just wanted to keep people safe and understand why she kept infecting people. Was she abused? Possibly. Probably. It was the early 20th century after all, and I'm not going to deny what is considered today as human rights abuses were more standard back then. But Mary herself wasn't an evil person. She just didn't understand nor believe in concepts like germ theory or that someone can be an immune carrier. To her, getting sick was simple. You presented with symptoms and either got better or died, and had the ability to pass the infection on while you showed symptoms. A writer can portray a villainous character who is evil who is based on or inspired by Mary Mallon, but writing a character based off of her doesn't retroactively make her evil, nor does that mean the writer thinks Mary Mallon was evil. And in turn, the audience would also know that Mary Mallon isn't evil just because the interpretation of her or a character based off of her is considered evil, because we're not stupid.
Your wages are stagnant because your boss is a greedy little shit who only cares about increasing his big pile of money, and nothing he says can change that, and all of his hardships are worth laughing at.
Lily, the fuck you on about?
Remember when this was about writing and writing tropes? I've talked about politics and financial issues and all sorts of nonsense, because Lily can't not talk about things that she's personally angry about and shove it into a video that it has no business being in.
Gee, I wonder why these stories are never done well. We could unpack why, but maybe we should just do it 1,000 more times and hope luck is on our side.
Do you think that stories are written because the perfect story hasn't come out yet and people's attempts at creative expression are just failed attempts at making the story to end all creativity? Do you think that when a story element is done perfectly that no one else should ever touch that element again? What is this sentence, and what is this line of logic? I honestly don't understand.
The problem with my idea for these kind of villains is that they inherently make white viewers of any gender uncomfortable because it might say something about their tacit support of the status quo. And that's the only reason these kind of stories are popular.
And that's why these story elements can be found in non-white countries, right, Lily? That's why non-white people write stories like this? Just because you cherry-pick 2 or 3 examples of a majority white American media written by white people doesn't mean that non-white Americans or non-Americans, white or not, cannot also write these stories.
Because they say to a complacent audience, you are already doing the right thing, and anyone who asks you to reconsider what you're doing is actually a liar, or they're in bad faith, or they're piloting a fucking death robot right now. And that's why I'll never be on board with these kind of villains, because they weren't written for me, and they will never be written for me. They're written for assholes.
Or could it be the disingenuous bad faith liar is actually you? You have such a distorted view of people, and what they do or enjoy casually as a job or a hobby says about them morally as people is honestly gross. Everything about what Lily says about storytelling in this video, from conception to consumption, is so mangled and twisted and perverted, specifically to give the most disingenuous and bad faith interpretation as possible. Well, that was painful, but thankfully I made it through Lily's warped and demented mind unscathed. Relatively. I just needed something that wasn't spinning my wheels with my Digimon video because my old laptop died a terrible death and I don't have easy access to my data recovery way out here in the wilderness of Canada, and my external hard drive with all my Digimon research is on my external hard drive that is also having issues and is still in transit back to me. So to recap, Lily doesn't fundamentally understand stories that she personally doesn't like. Either it's intentional because she seems to be a rage baiter, or maliciously because she thinks as a person with opinions she has the ultimate authority to morally grandstand. She's a hypocrite who complains that fandom is myopic and has one brain cell because they like an element of storytelling that she personally doesn't like, and then proceed for the next 10 minutes to tell us that there's only one correct way to write a story featuring a sympathetic issue and any other way is bad. She hates the idea of a sympathetic villain because in her mind they shouldn't be villains at all. Any individual can go about committing any kind of atrocity as long as it's in service for a cause that she personally agrees with, which is how literally anyone who has committed atrocities in history has justified the horrible things that they do. She views history through a preschool-level lens of good and evil, and anyone who did bad things in history have only done it because they're literal mustache-twirling monsters in human skin suits. If a writer writes a story, they must personally and politically endorse elements of that story. I imagine that if Lily ever saw Lolita, she'd be one of those people who thinks that Vladimir Nabokov is an actual hebephile, and sees his novel's antagonist, Humbert Humbert, as his self-insert for things that he actually wants to do instead of the reality, where it's a novel about the abuse of a child and the dehumanization and literal objectification of her through Humbert Humbert's eyes himself. To understand the mind of someone so twisted and demented. She'd be one of the myriad of people who looks at the surface elements of a novel and not only judges it based on the mere subject matter, but also judges the author as a person for daring to write such a thing. It's basically just pearl clutching. Considering you wrote Stockholm Lily, that sure is an interesting take to have. Thank you for making it to the end of my video. I apologize to my longtime subscribers for not getting a video out. I've also had a succession of many various tragedies happen one after another, ranging from minor to major inconveniences like tech issues, to outright serious hindrances on my ability to do my work that are beyond the scope of issues like that. Basically, think of many ways that something can go wrong for a person and flip a coin on whether or not it happened to me. But I want to start uploading videos again, and I wanted to use this video as a warm-up to continue on with my work on my Digimon video. If you like my work and want to support me, or even just kick my butt and make sure that I get my videos out, you can join my Patreon or Ko-fi. From there, you can join my Discord server and personally bug me and see updates about the progress of my videos. I also have a podcast that's still in the works 2 years later. Wow, we really need to work on those episodes faster. I also have a live stream called Team JYCT, Jacked, that's also streaming on Celtic Phoenix's channel. See you guys next time.